They told the crews the odds were acceptable. They said that if a man flew 30 operations over occupied Europe, he would be rotated home. Not celebrated, not spared, simply removed from the arithmetic. 30 missions, and the war would continue without him. He would be released from the night sky, permitted to sleep without listening for engines, allowed to forget the weight of altitude and the silence that followed explosions. What they did not say, what no briefing slide ever displayed, was that in 1942, a British bomber crewman had roughly a 1 in 2 chance of surviving long enough to reach that number. Some squadrons did worse, far worse. Entire crews disappeared between breakfast and midnight, leaving behind only empty bunks and unfinished letters. Personal effects were collected before dawn. Photographs were quietly removed from squadron walls. The term 30 mission tour quickly earned another name, spoken quietly and without irony, a death sentence with a timetable. At first, it did not look like one. The Royal Air Force's bomber war grew out of a theory rather than a battlefield. In the aftermath of the First World War, air power promised a way to bypass trenches, armies and navies entirely, bomb the enemy's industry, break morale, force surrender from the sky. It was clean in concept, decisive on paper, and merciful in comparison to another generation of mud and wire. The generals who had witnessed the Somme and Passchendaele believed they had found an alternative to mass slaughter. They had not anticipated that they were simply relocating it. Britain, geographically isolated and strategically vulnerable, embraced the idea with particular urgency. Heavy bombers became instruments not just of attack, but of national survival. By the early years of the Second World War, Bomber Command was expected to carry the weight of offensive action almost alone. While the Army rebuilt and the Navy fought its own desperate battles, the bombers flew into darkness, night after night, carrying the war to enemy soil. The geography mattered profoundly. Germany lay beyond the North Sea, defended by distance, weather, and darkness. Targets were scattered across industrial cities, many far inland, requiring hours of flight over hostile territory. To reach them required long-range aircraft, precise navigation, and crews trained to operate in contested airspace for 6, 7, sometimes 8 hours at a time. There was no margin for error. A single miscalculation could mean running out of fuel over the ocean or drifting into concentrated defenses. The doctrine emphasized mass. Hundreds of bombers flying together would overwhelm defenses. Night operations would reduce losses by hiding aircraft in darkness. Statistical models predicted acceptable attrition. Every loss was tragic, but mathematically tolerable. The planners worked with percentages, calculating how many bombers would need to reach targets to achieve strategic effect. They understood that some would not return. They believed the numbers justified the cost. The theory did not account for reality. Navigation at night over blacked-out Europe was an act of estimation bordering on guesswork. Cities hid beneath complete darkness. Rivers and coastlines, the usual landmarks, became invisible shadows. Early radar aids were crude and unreliable. Wind drift calculations were often wrong by miles. Crews reached target areas uncertain if the dark shapes below were factories, suburbs, farmland, or nothing at all. Some bombed empty fields. Others hit the wrong cities entirely. The gap between intention and execution was measured in lives. The bombers themselves were compromises born of necessity. Aircraft like the Wellington, Halifax, and later the Lancaster were engineering marvels for their time, but they were not designed for survival in an environment saturated with enemy fire. Defensive armament was limited to machine guns that could not match fighter cannon. Armor was minimal, sacrificed for bomb-carrying capacity. Speed was insufficient to outrun interceptors. Altitude provided only partial protection, and even that protection diminished as German fighters developed better climbing ability. These aircraft were cargo vehicles adapted for combat, and they showed their limitations every night. Training tried to compensate for these vulnerabilities. Crews drilled relentlessly. Gunnery exercises, navigation courses, emergency procedures, formation flying, radio protocols. They memorized checklists and learned to function as a single organism inside a vibrating aluminum shell, each man trusting the others with his life. Pilot, navigator, bomb aimer, wireless operator, flight engineer, gunners, each role essential, each man dependent on the others. A crew that worked together might survive. A crew with weak links would not survive long, but no amount of preparation could simulate what waited over the target. German air defenses were not static. They evolved rapidly, adapting to the bomber offensive with brutal efficiency. Radar stations tracked incoming formations from the moment they crossed the coast. Searchlights probed the sky, coordinated into deadly cones that could illuminate a bomber for fighters and flak alike. Flak batteries ringed cities, firing blind barrages calculated to intersect bomber streams at predicted altitudes. The shells exploded in patterns, filling cubic miles of sky with shrapnel. Fighter control directed night fighters, Bf-110s and Ju-88s, toward the bombers using increasingly sophisticated airborne radar. These aircraft hunted deliberately, slipping into formation from below or behind, firing upward into vulnerable bellies, then disappearing back into the darkness before gunners could respond. They developed tactics specifically designed to exploit bomber weaknesses. Some carried upward-firing cannons, allowing them to attack from blind spots. This was not aerial combat, as it had been imagined between wars. It was industrialized killing, executed by systems rather than individuals. The romance of nightly duels in the sky had no place here. Inside the bombers, the crews felt the discrepancy immediately. The aircraft was loud even in peacetime flight. Engines roared constantly. Metal vibrated. Communication required headsets and shouting. Over enemy territory, every sound carried meaning. The steady drone of engines was punctuated by the dull thump of flak bursts, close enough to rattle teeth and shake instruments. The fuselage flexed under pressure waves. The smell of cordite seeped through the cabin, mixing with oil, sweat, and fear. Men learned to read fear in small signs. A pilot's grip tightening on the controls until his knuckles whitened. A navigator recalculating for the third time in 10 minutes, unwilling to trust his own numbers. A rear gunner reporting nothing. Again and again, his voice too calm and too steady to be reassuring. Silence from any position could mean equipment failure, injury, or death. Flak was impersonal. It arrived without warning, detonating at altitude in black clouds that tore through aircraft with random precision. A single fragment could sever a control cable, rupture a fuel tank, shatter instruments, or kill a crewman without touching anyone else. Men survived missions with holes in their aircraft large enough to climb through. Others died from fragments no bigger than a fingernail. Fighters were different. They announced themselves with tracer fire, sudden flashes in the darkness that meant death was already close. Gunners tracked shapes they could barely see, firing into empty sky as often as not. The bombers were slow and heavy, designed for payload rather than maneuverability. Evasive maneuvers were limited to the corkscrew, a violent series of dives and climbs that bought seconds at best. Once a fighter found its mark, escape was unlikely. Crews counted missions obsessively. Chalk marks on lockers, lines scratched into notebooks, tallies kept in private, rarely discussed openly. Each sortie completed was a small victory, but also a reminder of how many remained before the magic number 30. Survivors described a narrowing of attention. On early missions, men noticed the view, the novelty, the scale of the operation. They marveled at the bomber stream stretching across the sky, at the lights of distant cities, at the strange beauty of searchlights sweeping through clouds. By the 10th or 12th mission, awareness shrank to instruments, checklists, and time. By the 20th, some stopped thinking beyond the end of the current flight. The future became an abstraction too dangerous to contemplate. The bomb aimer lay prone in the nose, staring through glass at the ground, rushing past thousands of feet below. He waited for the moment when training and instinct aligned, releasing the payload into darkness. He rarely saw the results. Often, he did not know if the target had been hit at all. Smoke and flame might confirm something had burned, but whether it mattered remained uncertain until reconnaissance photographs arrived days later. On the ground, civilians experienced the war differently but no less intensely. Air raid sirens cut through the night. Families crowded into shelters as the sky filled with the sound of engines. Bombs fell where navigation and wind dictated, not where intent had planned. Children slept underground. The elderly prayed. Morning revealed new ruins. German air defense crews worked through the night as well, exhausted and determined. Flak gunners stood at their posts, calculating lead and altitude in the darkness. Searchlight operators scanned the sky until their arms ached and their eyes burned. Night fighter pilots took off into darkness, knowing that a single mistake meant collision, flame, or disappearance. They too were part of a system. They did not choose the targets. They responded to them. Effectiveness came at a cost on every side. Bomber Command refined its tactics continuously. Bomber streams to reduce exposure time, pathfinders to mark targets with colored flares, electronic countermeasures to confuse radar, feint attacks to draw defenders away from main targets. Each improvement forced the defenders to adapt, escalating the technological contest. Losses fluctuated but never disappeared. Some nights were merciful, others were catastrophic. Entire squadrons could be decimated in a single operation. The Nuremberg raid of March 1944 cost 95 bombers in one night. Nearly 700 men vanished. The statistics were posted quietly. Crews read them anyway. A pilot recalled returning from a mission to find his aircraft riddled with holes, a fragment lodged inches from his head. He flew again 2 nights later. Another crewman remembered counting parachutes in the sky, knowing that some of those men would never be found, their bodies scattered across occupied territory or swallowed by the sea. Survival did not bring relief. It brought obligation. As long as a man was alive, he was expected to fly. Commanders faced their own calculations. Reducing losses meant reducing effectiveness. Canceling operations meant conceding initiative. Every decision balanced lives against strategic necessity, present casualties against future ones. There were no clean choices. As the war progressed, aircraft improved. The Lancaster carried heavier loads, flew higher, absorbed more damage than earlier bombers. Electronic aids improved navigation, allowing more precise targeting. But German defenses improved as well. The contest remained lethal until the final months. Men reached their 30th mission and were removed from operations. Some were sent to training units, teaching new crews, others to staff roles. They watched new crews arrive, young and unscarred, and tried not to remember faces from earlier months. Many struggled to sleep. The war did not leave when the flying stopped. Those who did not survive left little behind. A name on a board, a telegram to a family, a gap in a formation photograph. Their aircraft vanished into fields, forests, or the sea, often without witnesses. The war ended. The bombers stopped flying. Cities rebuilt. Doctrines were revised. The arithmetic faded from memory, but not from those who had lived inside it. Years later, survivors spoke less about fear and more about weight. The weight of responsibility. The weight of those who did not come back. The weight of knowing that survival had been, in part, chance. The 30-mission tour was never a guarantee. It was a line drawn through chaos, an attempt to impose order on a war that resisted it. For many, the count ended early. For others, it ended exactly at 30, leaving them alive but altered, carrying a quiet understanding that the sentence had been real, even when it was not completed. When the engines finally went silent, there was no victory parade inside the bomber crew's memories. There was only the knowledge of how thin the margin had been and how many had fallen through it. The sky over Europe grew quiet again. But for those who had flown through it, the noise never entirely faded.